What is happening here?
There's nothing left to say right now about that.
The Brown family, known to millions as the stars of Sister Wives, began their reality TV journey with the hope of opening up their lives and beliefs to the world. The premise was simple. One man, Kody Brown, and his multiple wives, all living under one roof, navigating life in a plural marriage. At first glance, it seemed like a unique, groundbreaking concept for a reality show. After all, not many people had seen a plural marriage so openly documented on national television. But behind the cameras, things weren't as idyllic as the show portrayed. When Sister Wives first aired in 2010, it was met with mixed reactions. Some viewed it as an eye-opening window into a lifestyle they knew little about, while others criticized it, calling it immoral or outlandish. Kody Brown, his 4 wives, and their combined children were thrust into the public eye, forced to navigate their personal lives under the watchful gaze of millions. The family's decision to participate in the show was about more than just sharing their lifestyle. It was about legitimizing their beliefs and showing that their way of life could work, that love and family structures didn't need to fit conventional molds. However, what many didn't anticipate was the intense pressure this level of public scrutiny would place on the family. The cameras, while offering a platform to express their beliefs, also exposed the fractures in their relationships, many of which were previously hidden or minimized. What started as an exploration of a non-traditional family soon became a display of personal conflicts, emotional distress, and the unraveling of relationships that had once been deeply intimate. For some of the Browns, the choice to do the show became less about educating the public and more about the perks, money, fame, and opportunities that were made available through the show's success. The family was initially motivated by a desire to bring awareness to polygamy, to show the world that it could work as a loving and functional family structure. But as the seasons progressed and the checks from TLC kept coming in, it became clear that the family's motivations were shifting. At first, the Browns presented themselves as a unique, loving family that was simply trying to survive in a world that didn't understand them. But as the show grew in popularity, the stakes changed. It was no longer just about surviving or coexisting. It was about maintaining a profitable TV show. And in the world of reality TV, the need to keep ratings high often comes at the cost of authenticity. The public's fascination with the Browns began to take on a life of its own. The cameras followed them through their struggles, their marriages, their breakups, and their personal dramas. The more they revealed, the more the public wanted to know, feeding a cycle that the family began to depend on. What started as an educational project turned into a machine that needed constant fuel, drama, controversy, and ever-present emotional turmoil. For Kody and his wives, the lines between reality and entertainment began to blur. Personal struggles, once private and sacred, were aired for millions to see. The price of fame became evident as the Browns found themselves navigating not just their own personal issues, but also the insatiable expectations of the viewers. One of the major consequences of the reality show's success was the toll it took on the family's dynamics. Kody, the patriarch of the family, had always maintained a delicate balance between his wives, but the constant exposure to cameras added a level of strain that had never been present before. The conflict between his relationships with his wives, particularly his growing distance from Janelle, Christine, and Meri, was accentuated by the cameras. The more the world saw, the more they began to scrutinize every moment, every word, and every action. Viewers picked up on things that might have otherwise remained behind closed doors, and soon the family's vulnerabilities were being dissected on social media, news outlets, and talk shows. Meri Brown, Kody's first wife, began to experience the consequences of this public exposure early on. Her personal struggles with Kody's attention, their evolving relationship, and her own dissatisfaction became increasingly difficult to hide. Meri, once the most prominent wife in Kody's life, found herself overshadowed by the younger, more vibrant wives. As Kody's emotional focus shifted toward Robyn, his 4th wife, Meri felt increasingly isolated and alienated. Her struggles were thrust into the spotlight as she became the subject of speculation about her role in the family, her relationship with Kody, and her own desires for independence. Christine Brown, who had once been the most emotionally secure wife, also began to experience the fallout from the show. Her relationship with Kody began to fray as the cameras continued to follow their every move. The family's dynamics, which had once seemed harmonious, became more complicated as Christine's struggles with Kody became more apparent. She had always dreamed of being loved and cherished by Kody, but the reality of being one of multiple wives began to chip away at her idealized vision of family life. She felt the pressure of living under the public microscope and was often forced to confront her own feelings of inadequacy in front of millions of viewers. Janelle Brown, the second wife, became the silent observer in many of these personal conflicts. She had always been the pragmatic and level-headed wife, but as the reality TV cameras captured more and more of her private life, Janelle found herself caught between her loyalty to Kody and her desire for personal growth. Her relationship with Kody was strained, but the show forced her to deal with these issues in front of an audience that was keen to pick apart every detail of her life. Janelle's story became one of quiet resignation and disillusionment. Despite the fame and the financial success that came with being on the show, she found herself struggling with a sense of identity and purpose. The pressure from the reality show did not just affect the wives, it began to affect the children as well. Growing up in a family that was constantly under the public eye had its challenges. The Brown children were no longer just children, they were public figures with their own struggles and challenges. As they grew older, they faced the unique burden of being raised in a family where their personal lives were constantly being broadcast to the world. For many of them, this experience was not only overwhelming, but damaging to their sense of self-worth and identity. As the Browns' reality TV journey continued, the effects of constant exposure and the growing focus on money and fame became clear. The emotional toll on the family was evident in their personal struggles, public arguments, and the eventual rift that formed between Kody and some of his wives. What had started as a show about family, faith, and love had transformed into a spectacle, one that prioritized drama over the very values it once claimed to uphold. The reality TV machine, designed to entertain and provide the Browns with fame and fortune, ultimately began to strip away the intimacy and authenticity that had originally been the foundation of their relationships. But as the Browns continued to rake in money from their appearances on the show, the question lingered. Were they really happy? Were they content with the sacrifices they had made for fame and fortune? And were they willing to continue living their lives under the public microscope for the sake of the money? As the seasons rolled on, the family's emotional and personal toll would only continue to grow. But the money they were earning, money that had come from their willingness to air their most intimate details for the world to see, seemed to keep them tethered to the show. For the Browns, reality TV had become more than just a way of life. It had become a necessity, one that came with a heavy price. As the years went by, the reality TV fame that the Brown family had once embraced began to take its toll. What started as a unique opportunity to showcase their polygamous lifestyle and challenge societal norms slowly turned into a financial juggernaut that the Browns couldn't easily walk away from. The money, the exposure, and the fame had become too deeply ingrained in their lives, and the sacrifices they had to make to maintain the show began to show more clearly. The issues that were once kept private, emotional struggles, marital difficulties, and family tensions, were now on full display for the world to see, and the lines between private life and public entertainment blurred beyond recognition. For Kody, the patriarch, the allure of fame quickly overtook any initial desire to share his religious beliefs or showcase the benefits of a plural marriage. In the early seasons of Sister Wives, Kody had come across as an idealistic, if somewhat controversial, leader trying to share his life and faith with the world. But over time, as the show gained popularity, his role shifted. Kody was no longer just a man living a life he believed in. He became a reality TV star who had to maintain the drama, keep the audience entertained, and manage a family dynamic that was increasingly under pressure. In the early years, the Browns had a sense of control. They made decisions together about what would be shown and how their lives would be presented. But as the show gained more and more success, Kody and his wives found themselves less in control of their own narrative. The network, TLC, began to push for more dramatic moments, more conflict, and more controversial storylines. What started as a family-oriented show, where they could talk about their beliefs and navigate their lifestyle, became more focused on the drama between the wives and Kody. The more tense moments the show could capture, the more viewers it would draw, and the higher the ratings would climb. The family, whose personal lives had been on display from the beginning, were now playing to an audience whose expectations of conflict and drama were growing ever stronger. Kody's relationships with his wives became a central point of interest for the audience, and the cracks that had already started to form in those marriages became even more noticeable. The growing tension between Kody and his first wife, Meri, became more apparent as the seasons progressed. The intimacy and connection that had once existed between them began to dissipate, and the emotional neglect that had been building between them for years started to surface. What viewers didn't see was that this wasn't just an issue of a dysfunctional marriage, it was a result of the pressure that reality TV was placing on their already fragile relationship. Meri, who had been Kody's first wife and once his closest confidant, felt the impact of the camera's lens more than most. As Kody's attention began to shift toward Robyn, his fourth wife, Meri felt increasingly isolated and alienated. The emotional intimacy that she had once shared with Kody was now redirected toward Robyn, and the dynamic in their family shifted in a way that left Meri on the outside looking in. While Kody may have seen the change as a natural evolution of their relationships, Meri couldn't help but feel betrayed. She had invested so much into the family, had given so much of herself to Kody and their life together, and yet she was now feeling discarded. For viewers, this emotional shift was both painful and compelling to watch, and it soon became a focal point of the show's narrative. The increasing rift between Kody and Meri wasn't just a private issue, it became public entertainment. Every emotional conversation, every fight, every uncomfortable interaction between Kody and Meri was captured on camera. And while the network encouraged this level of emotional exposure for the sake of ratings, it was taking a toll on their relationship. Meri, who had once been a pillar of the family, now found herself navigating the shifting dynamics with increasing difficulty. As her marriage with Kody faltered, the audience was there, watching, commenting, and speculating.
But it wasn't just Kody's relationship with Meri that was affected. The relationships between the other wives also began to show the cracks that were hidden behind the scenes. Janelle, Kody's second wife, was no longer the level-headed wife who had held everything together. Her relationship with Kody had always been a bit distant compared to his other wives, but as the show progressed, Janelle's frustrations with the family's public life started to bubble to the surface. Janelle had always tried to maintain a sense of stability in the family, but as the cameras rolled and the drama intensified, she found herself increasingly disillusioned with her role in the family. While she had always been practical and reserved, Janelle began to express feelings of neglect and discontent with the way things were unfolding. Christine, Kody's third wife, who had once been the emotional core of the family, also started to struggle with the pressures of being part of a reality show. Christine had always dreamed of being Kody's one and only, but the reality of sharing him with multiple wives took its toll on her. The show magnified her feelings of inadequacy, and her emotional struggles became more apparent as the seasons progressed. Christine's once vibrant and bubbly personality began to show signs of strain, and it was clear that the toll of being part of a reality show that aired their personal struggles for the world to see was beginning to weigh heavily on her. While Kody's relationships with each of his wives were under intense scrutiny, the show also placed an incredible strain on the children. The Brown children, who had been raised in a non-traditional family structure, were now thrust into the spotlight, and their
As the seasons of Sister Wives progressed, the pressure to keep the show entertaining and dramatic intensified. What started as a way to document a unique family lifestyle became a high-stakes game of keeping the audience hooked. Kody Brown, once an idealistic polygamist patriarch, was now playing a role, one that had to maintain a certain level of intrigue and spectacle to keep the ratings high. For him, the cameras were no longer just an observer of his family life. They had become an essential tool for his brand, his income, and ultimately, his identity. At the beginning of the show, Kody presented himself as a man of deep faith and commitment to his family. His love for his wives and children seemed genuine, as did his desire to educate the public about plural marriage. But as the years went on, his actions began to shift. The family's need to stay in the spotlight pushed Kody to adopt behaviors and strategies that catered to the show's demands. He became more of a character than a person, someone who was expected to deliver emotional moments, conflict, and drama. And while it may have started as a way to show the world their lifestyle, it became clear that the family was now performing for the camera in ways that sometimes didn't align with their true feelings. Kody's increasing attention to Robyn, his fourth wife, created one of the most dramatic shifts in the family dynamic. What had started as a deep connection between Kody and his first three wives slowly eroded as his emotional investment in Robyn intensified. While the cameras filmed the emotional fallout of this shift, the audience was captivated by the drama unfolding on screen. Kody's once affectionate and balanced relationships with his other wives were now marred by his increasing focus on Robyn, and the emotional fallout became a constant source of tension and conflict. But behind the scenes, the family members were struggling to make sense of their roles in the family and their own emotions about the dynamic. Meri, Kody's first wife, was the one who seemed to feel the most pressure. Having been with Kody the longest, she had always prided herself on their strong emotional connection. But as Robyn entered the family and Kody's attention began to shift, Meri found herself feeling like a shadow of her former self. She had invested so much of her life in her marriage to Kody, and now, with the public's growing fascination with Kody and Robyn, Meri struggled to find her place. The cameras only made things worse, as they captured her moments of vulnerability and emotional struggle. Meri found herself increasingly frustrated with the demands of the show and the lack of privacy in her personal life. She longed for the intimacy that had once been the foundation of her relationship with Kody, but that intimacy was increasingly being replaced by a camera crew, production schedules, and the pressure to deliver. Christine, Kody's third wife, also began to feel the pressure in ways that affected her mental and emotional health. As a woman who had dreamed of being Kody's one and only, she felt increasingly displaced by the attention Kody was giving Robyn. The cameras were there to capture it all: the fights, the tears, the moments of frustration, and Christine's growing sense of insecurity. What had once been a loving and affectionate relationship between Kody and Christine became increasingly strained as the demands of the show took center stage. Christine's desire to feel valued and important was constantly challenged by Kody's divided attention, and the public scrutiny only added to her emotional pain. She found herself questioning whether the show had truly been worth the toll it took on her relationship with Kody and her sense of self-worth. For Janelle, Kody's second wife, the pressure to be a part of the drama wasn't as pronounced, but she still felt the weight of the cameras in her life. Janelle had always been the calm, rational voice of the family,
but the show pushed her to be more involved in the emotional turmoil between Kody and his other wives. While Janelle was less concerned with maintaining the spotlight, she began to feel like an emotional caretaker, often trying to keep the peace between Kody and his wives while managing her own dissatisfaction with the family's changing dynamic. The cameras made it impossible for her to retreat from the stress and pressure that was building. Her own emotions, though sometimes hidden from the cameras, were becoming increasingly difficult to suppress. Robyn, the newest and most favored wife, also felt the pressure, though in a different way. On the one hand, she was living the dream of being Kody's one true love, the one who had his full attention and affection. But on the other hand, she was now at the center of the family's dysfunction, with her relationship with Kody being scrutinized at every turn. Robyn had come into the family as the newest addition, but quickly became the focal point of Kody's attention. The emotional weight of this, combined with the need to constantly prove her worth to the other wives, took a toll on her as well. Robyn was expected to navigate the complex dynamics of a plural marriage while also managing the expectations of a public that was eager for every detail of her life. As the seasons progressed, the cameras continued to amplify every issue within the family, often focusing on the drama and emotional conflict that was unfolding. The Browns began to realize that their lives had become part of a carefully crafted narrative. It wasn't just about their beliefs or their way of life anymore. It was about entertainment. Kody's desire to make his family's story compelling for viewers became a driving force, often overshadowing the genuine emotions that the family was experiencing. The show, once intended to document their lifestyle, had become a machine that demanded conflict, resolution, and a constant stream of drama. The Browns had now become a brand, and the pressure to maintain that brand had a profound impact on their relationships. They were no longer just a family living out their beliefs. They were reality TV stars who had to deliver. The show's success was tied to their personal lives, and every moment of emotional upheaval, every argument, every tear-filled confession became content for the audience. While the family was often criticized for airing their private struggles, it was clear that the need to stay relevant and keep the show going often overpowered their desire for privacy. The more the family leaned into the drama for the sake of the show, the more disconnected they became from the very values that had once guided their lives. The emotional toll of performing for the cameras was becoming too much to ignore. While the money was pouring in and the fame grew, the Browns found themselves questioning whether the price they were paying for it all was worth it. The tension between staying true to themselves and playing the game of reality TV was growing, and it was clear that the show's success had irrevocably changed the family. As the years passed and sister wives continued to thrive, the Browns found themselves caught in an increasingly complex web of fame, money, and emotional strain. Their relationships, once centered around love and faith, began to unravel under the weight of constant public exposure. What began as a family endeavor to share their lives with the world soon became an all-consuming machine, and the emotional costs of this new life were beginning to outweigh the benefits. Kody Brown, who once prided himself on his role as a leader in the family and a devoted husband to each of his wives, now found himself grappling with the reality that his life was no longer entirely his own. The camera crew was always there, watching his every move, recording his every word. His relationships with his wives became more performative than genuine, as the pressure to keep the show entertaining continued to grow. While Kody had initially embraced the idea of sharing his faith and lifestyle with the world, the reality of what that meant for his family became apparent as tensions rose behind the scenes. The family, who had once been able to work through their issues in private, was now constantly under the microscope. The cameras were not just capturing the good times, they were documenting every argument, every uncomfortable silence, and every unresolved issue between Kody and his wives. The emotional toll of living in a fishbowl was evident in the way the wives began to withdraw, struggling to balance their personal desires with the demands of the show. For Meri, the pressure of being on the show became unbearable. Once a confidant and the emotional core of Kody's life, she now found herself at odds with him in a way that was impossible to ignore. Kody's growing emotional connection with Robyn was evident to everyone, including Meri. As the family dynamic shifted, so too did Meri's place within it. What had once been a strong, supportive relationship now felt cold and distant. Meri had spent decades building her life with Kody, but now she was fighting to maintain her role in a family where her emotional needs were no longer being met. The strain in Meri and Kody's relationship was amplified by the fact that it was all unfolding on television. Every conversation that took place between them, whether it was an emotional outburst, a disagreement, or a vulnerable moment, was being broadcast to millions of viewers. It was no longer just about fixing their relationship in private. Now their private struggles were public entertainment. The emotional weight of this played a significant role in Meri's eventual struggles with her self-image and her relationship with Kody. Meanwhile, Kody Brown, who had always been one of the more outwardly positive and affectionate wives, began to experience her own emotional unraveling. Christine had dreamed of being Kody's one true love, but as his attention increasingly turned to Robyn, she began to feel more like an outsider in her own marriage. The cameras were there to capture it all: the fights, the tears, the moments of frustration, and Christine's growing sense of insecurity. What had once been a loving and affectionate relationship between Kody and Christine became increasingly strained as the demands of the show took center stage. Christine's desire to feel valued and important was constantly challenged by Kody's divided attention, and the public scrutiny only added to her emotional pain. She found herself questioning whether the show had truly been worth the toll it took on her relationship with Kody and her sense of self-worth. For Janelle, Kody's second wife, the pressure to be a part of the drama wasn't as pronounced, but she still felt the weight of the cameras in her life. Janelle had always been the calm, rational voice of the family, but the show pushed her to be more involved in the emotional turmoil between Kody and his other wives. While Janelle was less concerned with maintaining the spotlight, she began to feel like an emotional caretaker, often trying to keep the peace between Kody and his wives while managing her own dissatisfaction with the family's changing dynamic. The cameras made it impossible for her to retreat from the stress and pressure that was building. Her own emotions, though sometimes hidden from the cameras, were becoming increasingly difficult to suppress. And then there was Robyn. The newest and most favored wife became the central figure in the drama, especially as her relationship with Kody took center stage. Initially, Robyn had been a breath of fresh air in the family, a new wife who brought a sense of excitement and renewal. But as time went on, Robyn found herself at the heart of a growing divide within the family. As Kody's focus shifted toward her, the other wives began to feel increasingly alienated. The drama that played out on camera was only a reflection of the emotional chaos that Robyn herself was living. She had never asked to be placed in the center of this turmoil, but the show's producers quickly realized that the more tension there was between her and the other wives, the more compelling the content became. While Robyn's emotional struggles were certainly real, the show's producers knew that the public was hooked on the drama. What started as a unique family
By this point in the Brown family's reality TV journey, the lines between their real lives and the persona they had created for the cameras had become increasingly difficult to distinguish. With every new season of Sister Wives, the Browns' lives had shifted further away from their original intentions. What began as a family trying to normalize their unconventional lifestyle quickly morphed into a high-stakes game of reality TV, where drama, conflict, and emotional tension were essential for the show's success. And while the family's popularity and income had skyrocketed, so too had the emotional costs of maintaining the facade. Kody Brown, once a man of faith and conviction, was now navigating a world where his role as a patriarch was no longer defined by love and religion, but by the pressure to keep the audience engaged. He had always been a man who prided himself on his commitment to his wives and children, but the longer Sister Wives aired, the more he became a character, a persona that was molded and shaped to fit the narrative the producers wanted to tell. His marriages, which had initially been built on love and mutual respect, were now public spectacles that required constant management to maintain the family's TV brand. The Browns' transition from being a private family to a public entertainment entity was gradual, but as the years went on, it became clear that the allure of fame and the money it brought was beginning to change the family dynamics. The show, which had initially provided them with a platform to share their lifestyle and beliefs, now demanded more from them than they had anticipated. With every new season came increased pressure to deliver content that was dramatic and emotionally charged, something that would keep audiences hooked. The family, once united in their desire to share their unconventional life, had become a source of entertainment, and the consequences were becoming evident. Kody's relationship with his wives, which had always been complex, now became the subject of constant scrutiny. The conflict between his devotion to Robyn and his relationships with the other wives was no longer something that could be worked through in private. Every emotional conversation, every moment of tension was aired for millions to see. And while Kody had once prided himself on being able to balance the emotional needs of his wives, the realities of filming a reality show forced him to make difficult decisions that often placed his relationships under more strain. Meri, Kody's first wife, felt the impact of the show more than anyone. Once the center of Kody's emotional life, Meri now found herself struggling to maintain a connection with her husband as his focus shifted toward Robyn. The cameras captured Meri's frustration and her growing sense of isolation, but what viewers didn't see was the emotional toll it took on her behind the scenes. The show, which had once provided a platform for the family to share their beliefs, was now exposing their deepest vulnerabilities.
Meri, who had once believed in the power of her marriage and the foundation of their family, was now faced with the reality that her relationship with Kody was no longer the same. And every time she appeared on camera, her personal pain became a spectacle for the world to witness. The emotional turmoil that Meri experienced was compounded by the fact that her struggles were being broadcasted to millions of viewers. The pressure of knowing that her emotional vulnerability was being captured for entertainment was overwhelming. Meri's private battles with her marriage and her sense of self-worth became content for the show, something that both the producers and the audience eagerly consumed. For Meri, the emotional cost of being on the show was evident in her increasingly strained relationship with Kody and the growing divide between her and the other wives. She had always prided herself on being an integral part of the family, but now she felt like an outsider in her own marriage. Christine's story was similarly shaped by the demands of the show. As Kody's emotional focus shifted toward Robyn, Christine found herself grappling with feelings of neglect and emotional abandonment. What had once been a loving relationship between Christine and Kody was now clouded by the drama of being in a plural marriage on a reality TV show. The cameras captured every emotional breakdown, every fight, and every moment of tension between Christine and Kody. But what viewers didn't see were the long, quiet moments when Christine was alone, reflecting on her place in the family and the emotional toll the show was taking on her. The pressure to stay in a marriage that was becoming increasingly unbalanced was becoming more than she could bear, but the cameras never stopped rolling. The show required Christine to continue to perform, to present a smile and a happy wife persona, even when her heart was breaking. Janelle, Kody's second wife, had always been the pragmatic one, the one who kept the peace and avoided the drama. But as the years went on, she began to feel the emotional strain of living in a reality TV family. Janelle had always been the calm and rational voice, but now she found herself questioning the choices she had made and the cost of living a life under the spotlight. The show, which had initially brought the family closer together, was now pulling them apart. Janelle's relationship with Kody was increasingly strained, and the emotional disconnect between them was becoming harder to ignore. The cameras, which had once captured their happiest moments, were now documenting the growing tension between them. Janelle, who had always kept her emotions close to the vest, was now forced to confront the reality that her marriage was not what it once was. For Robyn, the newest addition to the family, the pressure was different. She had entered the family with excitement and a sense of renewal, but as the show continued, Robyn found herself in the center of a storm. Kody's increasing emotional attachment to her created tension with the other wives, and the cameras captured every moment of that tension. While Robyn's relationship with Kody was portrayed as the ideal marriage on the show, the reality was far more complicated. Robyn had entered the family hoping to build a life with Kody, but she quickly found herself at the center of a family in crisis. The emotional toll of being Kody's primary wife and navigating the fallout from the other wives was intense. The cameras, which were once a tool for sharing their lives, were now documenting Robyn's struggles and emotional pain. The children of the Brown family were not exempt from the emotional cost of the show. As they grew older, the pressure of being part of a reality TV family became more pronounced. Their lives were no longer private. They were part of the spectacle, part of the drama. The Brown children, once innocent bystanders to the emotional chaos of their parents' relationships, were now growing up in front of the cameras. The emotional toll of being raised in a family where every move was documented and scrutinized was significant. For many of the children, the constant public exposure created a sense of anxiety and insecurity. They were no longer able to live their lives with the constant pressure of being on television. As the family continued to navigate the challenges of living in the spotlight, the question remained, was the money worth it? The fame, the fortune, and the exposure were all part of the equation, but the emotional cost of maintaining the Sister Wives brand was undeniable. The Browns had built their lives around a reality TV show, but as the years went on, it became clear that the price of fame was more than they had bargained for. The show had brought them money and success, but at what cost? Behind the scenes of Sister Wives, the tension among the Browns was growing, and the emotional weight of the show was becoming increasingly hard to bear. The family, once united by their shared beliefs in polygamy, was now divided by the pressures of fame, money, and constant public scrutiny. What had started as an attempt to showcase their family dynamics and beliefs to the world had now transformed into a constant emotional roller coaster. Each of the wives was beginning to question whether the price they were paying for fame was worth it, and if they could continue to put their personal lives under such intense scrutiny. Kody, once a man committed to his family and his beliefs, found himself caught in a web of conflict that was becoming harder to escape. As the seasons went on, his relationship with each of his wives became more strained. Kody, who had always been able to balance the needs of his wives and keep the peace, was now facing the reality that maintaining multiple relationships while being in the public eye was an exhausting and almost impossible task. The constant need to perform for the cameras was taking a toll on his emotional well-being. Kody's growing attachment to Robyn, his fourth wife, became the focal point of much of the family's conflict. Robyn, who had once entered the family with the excitement of starting a new chapter with Kody, now found herself at the center of a storm of emotions. The cameras constantly focused on her relationship with Kody, which only heightened the tension with the other wives. Robyn's role as Kody's primary wife and the mother of his youngest children placed her in a position where she had to navigate the emotional fallout of the other wives' resentment and dissatisfaction. While Kody's increasing affection for Robyn was clear, it was also becoming clear that the emotional neglect of the other wives was damaging their relationships. Meri, Kody's first wife, felt the strain of this neglect more than anyone. Once the most important person in Kody's life, she now found herself struggling to maintain any emotional connection with him. Kody's attention had increasingly shifted toward Robyn, leaving Meri feeling isolated and unimportant. The emotional toll of this shift was compounded by the fact that it was all happening in front of millions of viewers. Meri's pain and frustration, which had once been confined to private conversations, were now being broadcast on television. What had once been a private matter between a husband and wife had turned into a public spectacle. Meri was left questioning not only her place in the family, but also the personal cost of being part of a reality show that had exposed the vulnerabilities of her relationship. Christine, Kody's third wife, was also struggling with the growing divide in their marriage. Kody's attention was increasingly focused on Robyn, and Christine, once the emotional heart of the family, was left feeling neglect and emotionally unfulfilled. As the tension between Christine and Kody grew, the cameras captured every tear, every argument, and every moment of heartbreak between Christine and Kody. What had started as a partnership built on love and mutual respect was now becoming a source of constant pain for Christine. She longed for Kody's affection and attention, but it was increasingly clear that his focus was elsewhere. The constant exposure of her personal struggles only added to the emotional burden she was carrying. Janelle, Kody's second wife, had always been the more level-headed and practical one. But as the years went on, even she began to feel the strain of living in a reality TV family. Janelle had always been emotionally independent, but as the show progressed, she began to feel increasingly alienated from the family. The demands of the cameras and the constant emotional turmoil within the family were starting to wear her down. Janelle had never been one to seek the spotlight, but she was now facing the reality that her personal life was being exposed in ways she had never anticipated. For Robyn, the newest addition to the family, the pressure was different. She had entered the family with excitement and a sense of renewal, but as the show continued, Robyn found herself in the center of a storm. Kody's increasing emotional attachment to her created tension with the other wives, and the cameras captured every moment of that tension. While Robyn's relationship with Kody was portrayed as the ideal marriage on the show, the reality was far more complicated. Robyn had entered the family hoping to build a life with Kody, but she quickly found herself at the center of a family in crisis. The emotional toll of being Kody's primary wife and navigating the fallout from the other wives was intense. While Kody's increasing affection for Robyn was clear, it was also becoming clear that the emotional neglect of the other wives was damaging their relationships. Meri, Kody's first wife, felt the strain of this neglect more than anyone. Once the most important person in Kody's life, she now found herself struggling to maintain any emotional connection with him. Kody's attention had increasingly shifted toward Robyn, leaving Meri feeling isolated and unimportant. The emotional toll of the shift was compounded by the fact that it was all happening in front of millions of viewers. Meri's pain and frustration, which had once been confined to private conversations, were now being broadcast on television. What had once been a private matter between a husband and wife had turned into a public spectacle. Meri was left questioning not only her place in the family, but also the personal cost of being part of a
As the seasons of Sister Wives progressed, it became increasingly clear that the emotional exhaustion of living for the cameras was taking its toll on the Brown family. What had started as an attempt to share their unconventional way of life with the world had evolved into an endless cycle of conflict, emotional strain, and public spectacle. The cameras, once an opportunity to tell their story, had become an omnipresent force in their lives, and with each new season, the emotional cost of keeping up the facade of a happy, harmonious family grew. Kody Brown, once a charismatic and energetic patriarch, was now visibly drained. The weight of managing 4 wives, multiple children, and a reality TV show had started to wear him down. In the early seasons, Kody had prided himself on his ability to balance his relationships and maintain the peace within the family. But as the show continued, it became clear that balancing so many different emotional needs, while also trying to keep up with the demands of filming, was taking a toll on him. The family dynamic, once filled with hope and excitement, had become increasingly strained, and Kody found himself unable to keep up the illusion of a perfect polygamous family. Kody's relationships with his wives, particularly his first 3, Meri, Janelle, and Christine, had become a source of constant tension. While the show had originally portrayed their family as an example of a loving and functional polygamous unit, the reality was far more complicated. Kody's relationship with Robyn, his 4th wife, had begun to overshadow his relationships with the other wives. His attention, once shared between Meri, Janelle, and Christine, was now mostly focused on Robyn, and this shift was causing deep emotional rifts within the family. The other wives began to feel increasingly neglected, and the cameras were there to capture every moment of their frustration and sadness. Meri, in particular, struggled with the growing emotional distance between her and Kody. Once the first and most important wife in his life, Meri now felt like an outsider in her own marriage. The emotional neglect she experienced became more apparent as Kody's relationship with Robyn flourished. Meri's feelings of isolation were magnified by the cameras, which followed her every move. The more the cameras focused on the tension between Kody and Meri, the more apparent it became that their marriage was no longer fulfilling. Kody's attention had shifted, and Meri found herself unable to navigate the changing dynamics of the family. She had hoped for a supportive and loving relationship with Kody, but as the years went on, it became increasingly clear that their connection was no longer what it once had been. Christine, who had once been Kody's emotional confidant, also began to feel the weight of the cameras and the emotional turmoil they brought. Her dreams of being Kody's one true love were shattered as Kody's attention turned toward Robyn. Christine, who had once been the most vocal about her desire for Kody's affection, was now left feeling emotionally abandoned. The show, which had once been a platform for them to explore their beliefs, was now amplifying the pain and isolation Christine felt in her relationship with Kody. The constant exposure to the public eye only added to the strain. Christine, whose warmth and charisma had once made her a fan favorite, began to withdraw emotionally, finding it harder and harder to keep up the facade of a happy wife for the cameras. Janelle, the second wife, who had always been the pragmatic and grounded member of the family, was also starting to feel the toll of being constantly in the public eye. Janelle had never been one for drama, but the constant pressure of maintaining the family's image was beginning to wear her down. She had tried to stay out of the emotional conflicts between Kody and the other wives, but as the cameras kept capturing her reactions to the growing tension, Janelle was forced to confront her own dissatisfaction with the situation. She had always hoped that polygamy would work for her family, but as time went on, it became increasingly difficult for her to ignore the cracks in their relationships. Janelle began to question whether the emotional cost of staying in the marriage was worth it. Robyn, the newest addition to the family, was caught in a difficult position. While she had entered the family with hope and excitement, she soon found herself at the center of much of the emotional drama. Kody's deepening emotional connection to her created tension with the other wives, and the cameras were quick to capture every moment of discomfort. Robyn, who had once been excited to join the family, now found herself questioning whether the price of being in the public eye was too high. The show's producers, always on the lookout for drama, fed off the tension between Robyn and the other wives, and what had once been a genuine desire to build a life with Kody now seemed overshadowed by the need to keep the viewers entertained. Robyn's emotional journey was now intertwined with the family's ongoing drama, and it became increasingly difficult for her to separate her feelings from what was being portrayed on screen. Despite the tension and the emotional toll it was taking on the family, the Browns had become addicted to the fame and the money that sister wives brought them. The show was a source of income that allowed them to live a lifestyle that many could only dream of, and it had given them the fame and recognition they never would have had otherwise. But as the years went on, it became clear that the family was trapped in a cycle. The show needed drama, the drama came from real-life emotional struggles, and those emotional struggles became harder to ignore as the family became more deeply entrenched in the world of reality TV. The question that lingered for the Browns was whether they could ever escape the grip that reality TV had on them. Could they continue to live their lives for the cameras, or would they be able to reclaim some sense of privacy and emotional peace? The fame and fortune that had come with the show were undeniable, but so too were the personal costs. Each of the wives, and even Kody himself, had sacrificed their emotional well-being for the sake of the show. The emotional exhaustion that had built up over the years was now visible on their faces, in their interactions, and in their struggles to keep the family intact. The pressure to perform for the cameras was no longer just a job. It had become a way of life, and it was clear that it was taking a toll that couldn't be ignored. As the years passed, the Browns' lives, once defined by faith and a unique family structure, had become increasingly dominated by the pressures of reality TV. What had started as a groundbreaking show about plural marriage and unconventional family dynamics had morphed into something much darker. Fame, money, and the intense scrutiny of the cameras had taken over their lives, and it was clear that the Browns were no longer living for themselves. They were living for the show. By the time Sister Wives reached its most dramatic moments, the emotional cost of being constantly on display had become to overshadow the reasons they first agreed to join the reality TV world. In the beginning, the show was about challenging societal norms and opening up about their beliefs on polygamy. Kody and his wives had hoped to create a platform for understanding and perhaps even acceptance. But as the seasons went on, the drama became the focal point, and the show's producers encouraged more conflict, more scandal, and more high-stakes emotional confrontations to keep viewers engaged. The family's emotional struggles were now the centerpiece of the show's success, and it was clear that the more turmoil they could showcase, the more popular the show became. The Browns found themselves trapped in a cycle that was difficult to break. The more they were expected to deliver, the more emotionally draining it became. Kody's relationships with his wives, which had already been complicated by the pressures of polygamy, were now deeply affected by the demands of reality TV. The show made it impossible for them to work through their issues privately. Every argument, every emotional breakdown, every unresolved conflict between Kody and his wives was laid bare for millions to witness. There was no space for privacy anymore. The family, once a unit focused on shared beliefs and love, was now a reality TV commodity that had to deliver for its audience.
For Kody, the pressure to keep the family together for the sake of the show became overwhelming. While he had always been the leader of the family, the role of patriarch now felt more like a performance. Kody had to constantly juggle the demands of his wives, their emotional needs, and the expectations of the show. The reality was that his personal relationships were beginning to take a backseat to the needs of the show. The family's conflicts and tensions became the driving force of the narrative, and Kody was caught in the middle, trying to balance his duties as both a husband and a reality TV star. Meri, Kody's first wife, found herself in a particularly difficult position. Her relationship with Kody had already been strained, but as the seasons wore on, the emotional neglect she had experienced became harder to ignore. The show, which had once been a platform for them to share their lives, now felt like an emotional trap. Meri had long struggled with feelings of abandonment, and the constant exposure of her personal pain only deepened the wound. The more the cameras focused on her emotional struggles, the more isolated she felt from Kody and the rest of the family. What had started as an attempt to normalize polygamy had become a circus, and Meri found herself playing a part that was increasingly hard to bear. Christine, Kody's third wife, also found herself at odds with the demands of reality TV. As Kody's attention turned more toward Robyn, Christine became more and more frustrated with the dynamics of their relationship. What had once been a loving partnership with Kody was now fraught with tension. Christine had hoped that by joining Kody's family, she would find a deep connection and a sense of belonging. But as time went on, she found herself increasingly left out. The more the cameras captured her emotional turmoil, the more she realized that the toll it was taking on her mental and emotional health was too great. The show demanded that she perform, but she was struggling to keep up the facade. Christine's emotional pain was evident on screen, and it was clear that she was reaching her breaking point. Janelle, the second wife, who had always been the pragmatic than the others, but even she could no longer deny the toll the show was taking on her. Janelle had always been the peacemaker, trying to keep things calm and balanced in the family, but as the years went on, it became more difficult for her to ignore the cracks in their relationships. The emotional cost of being on a reality TV show was weighing heavily on Janelle. She found herself questioning whether staying in the marriage was worth the emotional strain. Janelle, who had always been the voice of reason, was now caught between trying to maintain the family's image and dealing with her own growing dissatisfaction. The cameras only added to the pressure, and Janelle began to feel like she was trapped in a narrative that no longer aligned with her personal desires or emotional needs. For Robyn, the newest and most favored wife, the emotional pressure was also mounting. Robyn had entered the family with a sense of hope and excitement, but the reality of being at the center of so much conflict began to take its toll. While she had Kody's attention, she also found herself at the heart of the family's emotional drama. The constant comparisons between her and the other wives, the tension with Kody's first three wives, and the emotional strain of maintaining a public image began to wear on her. What had initially seemed like a fairy tale had quickly become a source of stress and turmoil. Robyn struggled to balance her own needs with the demands of being part of the Brown family, and the pressure to keep the peace between the wives was overwhelming. But it wasn't just the adults who were affected by the constant strain of living for the cameras. The Brown children, who had grown up in a polygamous family, were now being raised under the constant scrutiny of reality TV. Their every move was documented, and as they grew older, the reality of living under such public pressure became clearer. The children had to navigate their personal lives while being watched by millions. They were no longer just kids in a polygamous family. They were part of a reality show that documented every aspect of their lives. For many of the Brown children, this constant exposure was emotionally overwhelming. They had no space to grow up with the weight of the show hanging over them. As the Browns continued to live their lives in front of the cameras, it became increasingly difficult for them to separate their true feelings from the roles they were expected to play. The money and fame that had come with the show were undeniable, but so too were the personal costs. The emotional exhaustion, the constant need for drama, and the pressure to maintain a public image had become all-consuming. What had once been a genuine desire to share their lives with the world had turned into an emotional battle for survival. And despite the toll it had taken on their relationships, the Browns continued to choose the money over their personal well-being, perpetuating the cycle that had come to define their lives.
By this point, the emotional strain of the Browns' lives, constantly aired for the public to see, had reached a breaking point. The family, once united by shared beliefs in polygamy, had now been pulled apart by the realities of fame, fortune, and the demands of reality TV. What had once been a platform for Kody and his wives to showcase their family and their lifestyle had slowly transformed into a machine that demanded more and more drama with each passing season. The cost? Their emotional well-being, their relationships, and ultimately, their family unity. The toll of living their lives in front of millions of viewers was beginning to outweigh the benefits of fame and money. Kody Brown, once a hopeful and committed patriarch, was now a man struggling to hold together the pieces of a fractured family. The years of managing multiple marriages, raising children, and keeping up with the demands of sister wives had left him emotionally depleted. While Kody had always prided himself on being able to balance the emotional needs of his wives and children, the pressures of reality TV had made this impossible. The spotlight had shifted from being a tool for education and understanding to a tool for entertainment, and the family had become a source of constant drama. Kody's relationships with his wives, once filled with love and mutual respect, had been damaged by the relentless scrutiny of the cameras. His attention had shifted to Robyn, his fourth wife, and the growing distance between him and the other wives was impossible to ignore. Meri, Janelle, and Christine had all felt neglected, but the cameras were there to capture their frustration and pain. The emotional fallout of Kody's growing attachment to Robyn was evident in every conversation, every argument, and every tear-filled moment. What had once been a strong, supportive family unit was now an emotional battlefield where each wife was left fighting for Kody's attention and love. The producers of Sister Wives knew that the audience was drawn to the conflict. They thrived on the emotional highs and lows, the moments of tension between the wives, and the fallout of Kody's divided attention. But what viewers didn't see was the damage being done behind the scenes. The more the family performed for the cameras, the more disconnected they became from the love and respect they once had for each other. The need for drama, for emotional spectacle, began to overshadow the genuine emotions and relationships that had initially formed the foundation of the Brown family. Meri, the first wife, was hit hardest by the constant public exposure of her emotional pain. Once the center of Kody's world, she was now a woman who felt invisible, emotionally abandoned by her husband, and isolated in a family that no longer prioritized her needs. Kody's attention was firmly focused on Robyn, and while Meri had tried to maintain her composure, it was impossible to ignore the deep wounds that were festering within her. The cameras followed her every move, capturing her moments of heartbreak and frustration. Meri's personal struggle had become content for the show, something to entertain the viewers while she grappled with her fading relationship with Kody. Christine, too, had become the victim of this emotional fallout. Her once loving relationship with Kody had soured, and the cameras captured every bit of her growing frustration and pain. Christine had entered the marriage with the hope of being Kody's one true love, but that dream had been shattered as Kody's attention became focused solely on Robyn. Christine had always been a vocal and affectionate wife, but now the emotional support she once received from Kody was gone. The more the cameras focused on her heartbreak, the more she questioned whether this was truly the life she wanted. The toll on her mental and emotional health became clear, but the show demanded that she keep up appearances. The pressure to perform for the cameras had made it nearly impossible for her to have a private moment to process her emotions. Janelle, the second wife, had always been the practical and emotionally stable one, but even she couldn't escape the growing emotional turmoil of the family. She had always tried to keep the peace, to avoid the drama, but as the show wore on, Janelle found herself questioning her place in the family. The emotional strain was now too much for her to bear. She had always been the one who kept things running smoothly, but now she found herself drowning in a sea of unmet emotional needs and unresolved conflicts. The show had turned her into a supporting character in a drama that no longer reflected her true feelings or desires. Janelle began to wonder whether the price of staying in a polyamorous marriage, under the spotlight of reality TV, was worth it. Robyn, the newest wife, had once entered the family with excitement and hope, but now she was caught in the middle of a family divided. Kody's attention was solely on her, but the growing tension with the other wives created a toxic environment that Robyn could not escape. What had once been a fresh and hopeful addition to the family now felt like a source of constant emotional stress. Robyn was forced to navigate her relationship with Kody while also dealing with the resentment and anger from the other wives. The cameras captured every moment of her emotional struggles, but it was clear that Robyn, too, was paying a personal price for being in the family. The children, who had been raised in an unconventional family dynamic, now found themselves caught in the crossfire of their parents' emotional turmoil. The cameras had followed their growth and development from a young age, but as they grew older, they began to realize the full extent of the emotional costs of their parents' reality TV fame. The Brown children, who had once been innocent bystanders, were now forced to deal with the emotional fallout of their parents' choices. The constant exposure to the public eye was beginning to affect their personal lives, and they had no escape from the scrutiny of reality TV. As the family began to unravel, it became clear that Sister Wives was no longer the educational platform it had once been. The show had shifted into something else entirely, a reality TV spectacle that thrived on conflict, drama, and emotional pain. For the Browns, the price of fame and money had become far too high. The emotional toll of living for the cameras for the sake of entertainment was now visible in every interaction, every argument, and every tear shed. The question now was whether the Browns could ever escape the cycle they had found themselves in. Could they walk away from the fame, the fortune, and the demands of the show? Or would they continue to sacrifice their personal well-being for the sake of keeping Sister Wives on the air? For the Browns, the answer was clear. They had already made their choice. The money, the fame, and the success of the show were too powerful to walk away from, even if it meant sacrificing their emotional health and family unity. As the years went on, it became increasingly clear that the Sister Wives family was no longer the cohesive unit it had once been. The emotional and psychological toll of living in front of the cameras, combined with the increasing pressure to deliver drama for the show, had driven wedges between Kody and his wives. The relationships that had once been founded on love, faith, and mutual respect were now overshadowed by years of constant public scrutiny. The need for drama, for emotional spectacle, began to overshadow the genuine emotions and relationships that had initially formed the foundation of the Brown family. Meri, the first wife, was hit hardest by the constant public exposure of her emotional pain. Once the center of Kody's world, she was now a woman who felt invisible, emotionally abandoned by her husband, and isolated in a family that no longer prioritized her needs. Kody's attention was firmly focused on Robyn, and while Meri had tried to maintain her composure, it was impossible to ignore the deep wounds that were festering within her. The cameras followed her every move, capturing her moments of heartbreak and frustration.
Meri's personal struggle had become content for the show, something to entertain the viewers while she grappled with her fading relationship with Kody. Christine, too, had become the victim of this emotional fallout. Her once loving relationship with Kody had soured, and the cameras captured every bit of her growing frustration and pain. Christine had entered the marriage with the hope of being Kody's one true love, but that dream had been shattered as Kody's attention became focused solely on Robyn. Christine had always been a vocal and affectionate wife, but now the emotional support she once received from Kody was gone. The more the cameras focused on her heartbreak, the more she questioned whether this was truly the life she wanted. The toll on her mental and emotional health became clear, but the show demanded that she keep up appearances. The pressure to perform for the cameras had made it nearly impossible for her to have a private moment to process her emotions. Janelle, the second wife, had always been the practical and emotionally stable one, but even she couldn't escape the growing emotional turmoil of the family. She had always tried to keep the peace, to avoid the drama, but as the show wore on, Janelle found herself questioning her place in the family. The emotional strain was now too much for her to bear. She had always been the one who kept things running smoothly, but now she found herself drowning in a sea of unmet emotional needs and unresolved conflicts. The show had turned her into a supporting character in a drama that no longer reflected her true feelings or desires. Janelle began to wonder whether the price of staying in a polygamous marriage, under the spotlight of reality TV, was worth it. Robyn, the newest wife, had once entered the family with excitement and hope, but now she was caught in the middle of a family divided. Kody's attention was solely on her, but the growing tension with the other wives created a toxic environment that Robyn could not escape. What had once been a fresh and hopeful addition to the family now felt like a source of constant emotional stress. Robyn was forced to navigate her relationship with Kody while also dealing with the resentment and anger from the other wives. The cameras captured every moment of her emotional struggles, but it was clear that Robyn, too, was paying a personal price for being of the family. The children, who had been raised in an unconventional family dynamic, now found themselves caught in the crossfire of their parents' emotional turmoil. The cameras had followed their growth and development from a young age, but as they grew older, they began to realize the full extent of the emotional costs of their parents' reality TV fame. The Brown children, who had once been innocent bystanders, were now forced to deal with the emotional fallout of their parents' choices. The constant exposure to the public eye was beginning to affect their personal lives, and they had no escape from the scrutiny of reality TV.